The boy sat beneath the shade of tall plane trees. The Macedonian sun filtered through the leaves, warm and golden, yet the boy shivered. His eyes burned with a hunger no child should carry. This boy was Alexander, son of King Philip II, heir to a restless kingdom on the edge of Greece. And today, he was waiting for the man who would change his life forever. From the path beyond the garden came the sound of measured footsteps. The boy stood as a figure in a simple white chiton approached, scrolls in one hand, staff in the other. His beard was neatly trimmed, his eyes sharp and searching. This was Aristotle, the most brilliant mind in Greece. The greatest philosopher had been summoned to the wild north to teach the son of a king, and perhaps more than a king. Most people imagine that Aristotle taught Alexander poetry, ethics, and philosophy. But what if he taught him something far more dangerous? Aristotle sat across from the boy and unrolled a scroll. Today, he said, we speak not of Homer or the gods. Today, we speak of power. He told Alexander that there were two kinds of men, those who rule and those who are ruled. He spoke of natural hierarchies, of kingship as a divine order. And then, in a low voice, he told him something few were ever meant to hear, that the Greeks were destined to rule the barbarians of the world. This was no mere education. It was a blueprint for conquest. Imagine the young prince's mind catching fire. The lessons were not just about virtue but about dominion. How a ruler must be both lion and fox, philosopher and killer. Aristotle taught Alexander about medicine, how to treat wounds and fevers. But he also taught him about poisons, which herbs healed and which herbs killed silently. He taught him about nature, about the order of the stars, about the immortal soul. But he also taught him about tyrants, how they rise and how they fall. And perhaps he whispered to him the unspoken truth, that one day he would not just rule Macedonia, he would rule the entire world. But Aristotle's lessons were not gentle. He took Alexander to dissect animals, to study life and death with cold eyes. He showed him that the world was not guided by the whims of the gods, but by cause and effect, by laws that could be studied, predicted, mastered. For the first time, Alexander saw himself not as a pawn of destiny, but as a man who could shape destiny with his own hands. Soon, the lessons went beyond philosophy. Aristotle taught him the secrets of rhetoric, how to move a crowd with a single word, how to turn enemies into allies, and allies into tools. He taught him the hidden history of Greece, the rise and fall of Athens, the bloody lessons of the Peloponnesian War, the weaknesses of Persia. Every lesson was a weapon, every scroll a sword. The boy became restless. He wanted to see these lessons tested, to feel the weight of a real spear in his hand. One day, Aristotle placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Knowledge is not enough. You must act. Philosophy without action is empty." It was the spark Alexander needed. Within months, he was no longer a boy who read about heroes. He was a boy who trained to become one. He drilled with the Macedonian phalanx, rode his horse until the beast obeyed like an extension of his will, and sparred until his body ached. But every night, he returned to Aristotle. And every night, the philosopher gave him a little more, a secret here, a hidden truth there, shaping the prince into something the world had never seen before. But there was a darker edge to this education. Aristotle warned Alexander never to trust the tyranny of the mob, never to let the masses rule him. He taught him that mercy must be weighed against necessity, that some lives could be sacrificed for the greater order. The boy listened, and somewhere deep inside him, a decision began to form. He would not just be a king. He would be a world king, a man who would bend the earth itself to his vision. Years later, when Alexander marched into Persia, when he burned Persepolis, when he crossed into India, he carried Aristotle's lessons with him like invisible weapons. But even then, there was a question no one could answer. Had Aristotle created a philosopher king, or had he unleashed something far more dangerous? Because power, once given, cannot be contained. And the boy who once sat beneath the trees was beginning to outgrow even his teacher. The years passed, and the boy became a man. Alexander now rode at the head of his father's cavalry, his armor glinting in the Macedonian sun. But at night, when the campfires burned low, he still turned over Aristotle's words in his mind. The philosopher had told him that kingship was divine, that men like Alexander were born to lead. But he had also warned him that hubris, arrogance before the gods, was the doom of great men. And Alexander, now 19, was beginning to test the limits of both lessons. When King Philip II was assassinated in 336 BCE, the world shook. The court was thrown into chaos, the nobles whispering, rival princes plotting. But Alexander acted with a calm Aristotle himself might have admired. He seized power instantly. He ordered rivals executed, quashed rebellions, and marched on rebellious Greek cities with fire and sword. Aristotle's lessons on decisive action were no longer just theory. They were now written in blood. But something was changing. At first, Aristotle was proud. His student had become what he had hoped, a philosopher king, one who could act with justice but also with iron resolve. Yet soon, Alexander's ambition began to disturb him. The young king began speaking not just of ruling Greece, but of conquering Asia, of marching beyond the limits of the known world. Aristotle warned him, "Do not seek to be more than human. Even the mightiest king is bound by measure. Even the gods punish those who reach too far." But Alexander only smiled. What if the gods are not to be feared, but surpassed? The campaigns began. Alexander crossed into Asia and smashed the Persians at the Granicus River. He liberated Greek cities on the coast, then pushed deeper into enemy territory. Each victory only fed the fire in his soul. The boy who had once listened under the trees now commanded armies that spanned the horizon. And with every march, every battle, Aristotle's influence began to fade. But the teacher had not been forgotten. Alexander carried with him a chest of Aristotle's writings, philosophy, science, medicine. At night, after the fighting, he still read them by torchlight. Yet something gnawed at him. Aristotle had taught that Greeks were destined to rule, that barbarians were naturally slaves. But when Alexander looked at the Persians, he saw warriors, craftsmen, thinkers, not slaves. He began to marry Persian customs with Greek ones. He dressed like a Persian king, held Persian-style court, demanded his men bow before him. The Greek officers hated it. And Aristotle, back in Macedonia, was horrified. Letters passed between them, tense and cold. Aristotle reminded Alexander of his Hellenic identity, of the purity of Greek culture. Alexander replied that he sought to unite East and West, to make a world where all men were one people. It was a break far deeper than teacher and student. It was a break between two visions of the world, one narrow, ordered, rooted in Greek superiority. The other vast, dangerous, limitless. Whispers began to spread that Alexander was no longer merely a king, but saw himself as a god. He claimed descent from Zeus Ammon, demanded divine honors, and spoke of conquering not just Persia but India and beyond. Aristotle's teachings of balance and moderation were long gone. Instead, Alexander was now guided by a vision so enormous that even Aristotle would have called it madness. But there was a darker turn. Some sources claim that Alexander ordered the death of Callisthenes, Aristotle's own relative and a philosopher in his court, after he opposed the king's demand for proskynesis, the bowing ritual. This was no small act. This was a warning shot, sent back across the miles to his old teacher. It said, "I am no longer your student. I am greater than you. And if you oppose me, you too can fall." In that moment, Aristotle must have felt a cold dread. He had shaped this man, given him the tools of reason, the vision of empire, the knowledge of power. But he had also unleashed him. And now, the whole world would pay the price. Alexander pressed on, Deeper into Asia, his army growing restless, the weight of his conquest straining even his own will. But one question haunted him at night. Had he gone too far? And somewhere, back in Greece, an old philosopher wondered the same thing, and whether his greatest work had become his greatest mistake. Because when a teacher gives a student the tools to change the world, he must live with whatever the student chooses to build or to burn. By the time Alexander reached Babylon, the world was at his feet. The Persian Empire had been crushed, his banners flew from Egypt to the edge of India, and the treasures of kings filled his vaults. But something else filled his heart. Not joy, not peace, a creeping darkness. The victories had come too easily, and the men who once loved him now whispered behind his back. He had begun to see conspiracies everywhere, plots in the shadows, betrayal in every glance. The philosopher king was becoming something else entirely. Witnesses said Alexander started drinking more than ever. At his famous banquets, the wine flowed like rivers. He stayed awake through the night, debating with philosophers, laughing too loudly, and sometimes weeping uncontrollably. Was he haunted by Aristotle's warnings? Even the mightiest king is bound by measure. Even the gods punish those who reach too far. If those words echoed in his mind, they came too late. One night, at a feast in Babylon, tragedy struck. Clitus the Black, one of Alexander's most trusted generals, spoke out against him. He reminded Alexander of his mortal birth, mocked the Persian court rituals, and questioned the king's claim to divine status. The room fell silent. Alexander, drunk and trembling with rage, grabbed a spear and drove it through Clitus' chest. The man who had saved Alexander's life in battle lay dead on the floor. In that moment, Alexander collapsed into despair. He locked himself in his quarters for days, refusing food, weeping until he could barely speak. The king who had conquered the world was at war with himself. Aristotle, far away in Greece, must have heard the news. What did he think? That his brilliant student had finally crossed the line he warned him never to cross. Some later writers even whispered that Aristotle began to fear Alexander might return to Greece not as a hero, but as a tyrant. And so, the most dangerous rumor of all began to spread, that Aristotle, the great teacher, the mind that had shaped Alexander, may have plotted to end him. Months later, Alexander fell mysteriously ill after a banquet. The accounts differ. Some say he was struck with fever, others that he cried out in pain as if something burned inside him. For 12 days he lay dying, unable to speak, unable to move. His soldiers filed past him, weeping as they saw their king reduced to a shadow of the man who had led them across the world. And then, one evening, he was gone. He was just 32 years old. Was it malaria? Typhoid? Or was it something far more deliberate? A cup of poisoned wine slipped to him at that fateful feast? Some historians point to Antipater, Alexander's regent in Macedonia, who feared the king's return. Others point even higher, to Aristotle himself, who may have feared that his greatest student had become the monster he warned against. The truth? It has never been proven. Alexander's body was said to be so perfectly preserved that some believed he had not died at all, but had simply passed into divine sleep. Yet one thing is certain: Aristotle lived on, dying peacefully a year later, and his writings would shape Western thought for centuries. But in every account of his life, there is a shadow, a question history can never answer. Did the philosopher who taught the boy to think also teach the world's most dangerous man how to die? When we speak of Aristotle and Alexander, we speak of more than teacher and student. We speak of the birth of an idea, that one man could unite the world through force, guided by reason, driven by destiny. But ideas, once released, cannot be controlled. Perhaps Aristotle did not poison Alexander's wine. Perhaps he simply planted the seed that made such an end inevitable. Because sometimes, the deadliest thing a teacher can give a student is the belief that he can become more than a man, that he can become a god.